Welcome to the Right News Network.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emma with the headlines that matter most right now. Tonight, the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran is shattered, destroyers under fire, missiles flying, and both sides blaming each other for breaking the deal. Our Middle East correspondent, Layla Nazari, is tracking developments from the region. Layla, what exactly happened in the Persian Gulf?
Yeah, Emma, and this escalated fast. Thursday night, 3 American destroyers came under coordinated attack in the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking fast attack boats, missile fire, a real swarm operation. The U.S. shot back, hitting Iranian launch sites for missiles and drones, 2 locations. But here's where it gets tricky. Iran's saying they were defending themselves, that American forces attacked first. I was speaking to a regional security analyst this morning who described it as, and I quote, a blame game spiral with live ammunition.
So who fired first? Does anybody actually know?
That's the million-dollar question, Emma. And frankly, the answer depends entirely on which military you're asking. CENTCOM's account is very clear. Unprovoked Iranian aggression, proportional American response. Tehran's narrative is inverted completely. They claim an American attack on an oil tanker triggered their response. What's significant is neither side has much incentive to back down right now. Intelligence shows Iran's got months of operational capacity left.
Layla Nazari in the region. Thank you. Still on world, Trump's playing hardball with Europe. July 4th deadline on a trade deal or face massive new tariffs. But here's the catch, his tariff authority keeps getting shredded in court. Our Washington correspondent Marcus Webb has been tracking this all morning. Marcus, what's the real leverage here if judges keep blocking these tariffs anyway?
Yeah, Emma. And that's the question nobody's quite answering. Look, I was speaking to a trade analyst this morning who said Trump's threats sound powerful until they hit the courthouse steps. The Court of International Trade just killed his second round of global tariffs. So we're in this weird space where the president's threatening tariffs that the courts say he can't legally impose.
So he's threatening something he might not be able to deliver.
Exactly. But, and this is important, the EU doesn't necessarily want to call his bluff. Von der Leyen took his call. They're engaged in talks. They might calculate that even a blocked tariff creates chaos and uncertainty in markets for weeks, and that's costly. So they could be incentivized to negotiate just to avoid the headline risk, even if legally Trump loses in court later.
3 weeks is tight. How's this resolve?
Either they strike a deal before July 4th, which would be a genuine shift in US-EU relations, or Trump issues the threat, the EU pushes back, it goes to court for a third time, and we're back where we started. Meanwhile, American exporters and European businesses are caught in the middle.
Marcus Webb in Washington. Thanks. Still on world affairs, the U.S. just struck back at Iran after attacks on American warships in the Persian Gulf. No ships hit. But the message was clear. Layla, good to have you back. What's actually driving this right now?
Yeah, Emma. And look, the timing here is significant. These aren't random attacks. What I'm hearing from sources in the region is that Iran's been testing American resolve, probing the boundaries of what the Biden administration will tolerate. The naval strikes in the Persian Gulf were deliberate. They wanted to see how Washington responds. And frankly, that's a dangerous game.
So this is calculated messaging between capitals?
Exactly. Both sides are trying to establish red lines without crossing into outright war. The U.S. struck back hard enough to demonstrate they won't be pushed around. Iran gets to claim they're standing up to American pressure. But, and this is what worries analysts I've been talking to, every exchange like this narrows the space for diplomacy. The risk of miscalculation grows with each cycle.
Layla, thanks for that context. Also on the world front, U.S. Navy destroyers came under fire in the Persian Gulf Thursday. Iran says it fired first, America says it didn't. Our Washington correspondent Marcus Webb is following developments. Marcus, what exactly happened out there?
Yeah, Emma. So 3 Navy destroyers were transiting the Strait of Hormuz, which is routine for U.S. operations. But Iranian forces opened fire on them. The Navy shot back and then targeted Iranian military facilities. Now here's where the stories diverge. Iran's claiming they acted because the U.S. had targeted one of their commercial tankers. The Pentagon says that's not true, says the Iranian attack was unprovoked.
Why does this matter beyond the immediate confrontation?
Look, the Strait of Hormuz is essentially the world's oil artery. A third of maritime petroleum moves through there. Any sustained military escalation in those waters, and you're talking about global energy prices spiking, shipping getting more expensive. Both sides are digging in on their versions of what happened. And frankly, Emma, that's the dangerous part. When neither side trusts the other's account, it becomes much harder to de-escalate.
Marcus, appreciate the reporting. Also on the world front, 3 American destroyers just came under fire in the Persian Gulf, and the U.S. shot back hard, strikes on 2 Iranian ports in response. Our technology correspondent Alex Park has been tracking the military assets involved. Alex, what exactly happened out there?
Yeah, Emma. And this is direct. These 3 Navy destroyers were moving through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrowest part of it really, when they took fire from Iranian positions abutting the shore. The Pentagon response was swift. They launched strikes on port facilities on the Iranian side. What I'm hearing from defense officials this morning is they're characterizing this as a contained response. But Emma, the risk here is it breaks the ceasefire that's been holding, however tenuously, for months.
How significant is the Strait of Hormuz militarily and economically?
Look, it's everything. 1/3 of global oil shipments move through that choke point every single day. You're talking about roughly 21 million barrels passing through daily. From a military standpoint, it's a bottleneck where tensions compound because there's nowhere to go. The ships are essentially moving through a corridor. Iran knows this leverage. The US knows Iran knows it. And frankly, Emma, that dynamic hasn't changed since the 70s.
Alex Park, thanks for that context. Also on the world front, a federal court just dealt President Trump a major legal defeat on his signature economic policy. A trade court ruling says his universal 10% tariff is flat out illegal. We're learning that small business owners who challenged the levies won their case. Sophia Reeves is our finance editor. Sophia, what does this actually change for American businesses right now?
Yeah, Emma, and here's the thing. This ruling doesn't immediately kill the tariff. What it does is create real legal jeopardy for the entire policy. Small businesses that sued were arguing Trump never had the authority to impose this across the board, and 3 federal judges agreed with them. I was speaking to a trade attorney this morning who told me we're probably looking at an appeal, maybe even Supreme Court. The administration's not backing down.
So consumers and businesses are stuck in limbo. How long does that uncertainty typically last?
Look, appeals in trade cases can take months, sometimes longer. What's striking here is the court was very direct about this. They said Section 122 of the Trade Act doesn't authorize what the president did. That's a pretty clean legal statement. And frankly, Emma, that makes this harder to defend on appeal. But the White House will try anyway, because backing down means admitting the entire tariff structure was built on sand.
Sophia Reeves, thanks. A deadly hantavirus outbreak aboard a cruise ship heading to Spain has claimed 3 lives and spread across continents. But tonight, the World Health Organization is offering some reassurance. The MV Hondias departed Argentina with 7 confirmed or suspected cases on board, and passengers who left before symptoms emerged are now being tracked in 5 American states and beyond. Here's what matters. The WHO says this isn't another pandemic situation because hantavirus simply doesn't spread the way COVID did. But the timing problem is real. People scattered before anyone knew they were sick, and now health officials are racing to trace contacts. Argentina, where this cruise left, has the highest hantavirus rates in the region, and that's the big unanswered question tonight. Where did this outbreak actually come from? Tonight, big tech is facing its biggest threat in a generation. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle are moving to strip away the legal immunity that's protected social media companies for nearly 3 decades. The question now is whether they can actually pull it off. Alex rejoins me now. Alex, what's Section 230 and why does it matter so much?
Yeah, Emma. So Section 230 was written back in 1996. Basically gave platforms legal immunity from the content their users post. It's been the bedrock of the entire internet as we know it. But here's where we are now. There's genuine bipartisan anger that this law is being weaponized. These companies are using it as a shield while their algorithms amplify the worst content because it drives addiction, especially among kids. I was speaking to staffers this morning on the Hill who told me the child safety angle is what's actually moving votes here.
So if they kill Section 230, what happens to social media?
That's the messy part, Emma. If you strip away that immunity, platforms face potential bankruptcy from litigation. But here's the catch. The tech industry argues that without Section 230, you'd actually see less moderation, not more, because companies would either shut down user content entirely or go bankrupt defending lawsuits. And frankly, smaller platforms and startups, they'd disappear overnight. You'd be left with maybe 3 or 4 companies with enough lawyers to survive.
So no perfect answer here.
No perfect answer. What I'm hearing from legal experts is that we're probably headed toward a modified version of the law, not outright repeal. Something that holds platforms accountable for algorithmic amplification while keeping the basic framework intact. But that's going to take years to sort out legislatively.
Alex Park, thanks. Trump sits down with Brazil's president today and comes away with a headline. Lula is saying Trump promised no invasion of Cuba. Sophia Reeves is following the diplomatic signals coming out of this White House meeting. Sophia, what does that assurance actually mean for the region?
Yeah, Emma. On the surface, it sounds straightforward, but here's what's significant. Latin American capitals have been genuinely worried about military intervention rhetoric from this administration. Lula choosing to broadcast this commitment publicly, that tells you something. It's not just a private reassurance. It's Lula trying to lock in a diplomatic win and stabilize a relationship that's been deeply fractured. I was speaking to trade analysts this morning who said this kind of clarity matters because it unblocks other conversations about commerce and regional security.
They skipped the joint appearance, though. What does that signal?
That's the tension right there. You don't avoid the cameras together if things are actually fixed. What I'm hearing from sources close to the White House is these two still have fundamental disagreements on trade policy and energy markets. The Cuba assurance gets headlines, but it doesn't resolve the underlying friction between Washington and Brasilia. And frankly, that matters because Brazil's influence in the Persian Gulf energy discussions and Latin American trade blocs gives it real leverage.
Sophia Reeves, thanks. On the energy front, major Gulf oil producers are now running tankers through the Strait of Hormuz with their tracking systems switched off. Our Europe correspondent, Elena Vasquez, is following this. Elena, why would the UAE resort to this kind of operation?
Yeah, Emma. And this is significant because what we're seeing is basically a desperation move dressed up as logistics. The UAE state oil company is operating what you'd call ghost fleets, same tactic sanctioned Iranian ships use, because conventional shipping through the Persian Gulf isn't functioning anymore. I was speaking to a maritime industry source this morning who told me the economics are brutal. Running dark costs money, it's risky, but losing revenue costs more.
So they're admitting the strait is effectively closed?
Not in so many words. But look, when your only option to keep exports moving is to turn off your transponder and hope nobody notices, you've already lost the argument about free passage. What's striking here is that insurance companies have essentially priced normal shipping out of reach. So even if vessels have transponders on, they're being routed hundreds of miles out of their way. The net effect is the same. The strait is constrained.
Elena Vasquez, thanks.
Time to go deeper. Beyond the headlines, our full analysis of the story shaping the world right now.
Three passengers are dead. A British crew member is fighting for their life. and health officials across 5 American states are now scrambling to monitor people who walked off a cruise ship before anyone even knew there was a problem. The MV Hondius, a Dutch expedition vessel that departed Argentina for Antarctica, is at the center of what the WHO is calling a hantavirus outbreak. But in the same breath, they're telling us not to worry. It's not COVID. Joining me now are Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst, and Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor. Marcus, let me start with you. Is the WHO's response here reassuring, or is it exactly the kind of institutional messaging that should be making us more nervous, not less?
Thanks, Emma. Look, when an organization that spent the first critical weeks of COVID-19 essentially acting as a mouthpiece for Beijing steps forward and tells the world don't panic, the appropriate response is not to relax. It's to verify. 3 people are dead. Passengers have been dispersed across the United States, the United Kingdom, and multiple other countries. And the WHO's headline message is that this isn't COVID. That's not reassurance. That's narrative management. The Andes strain of hantavirus, which is associated with Argentina, the very country this cruise departed from, has documented person-to-person transmission capability. Argentina is consistently ranked by the WHO itself as having the highest incidence of hantavirus in the entire region. So when we're told by this same organization that the situation is under control, I'd want to know exactly which strain we're dealing with, what the transmission profile looks like, and why passengers were allowed to leave that ship and board international flights before a single alarm was raised. I'll say this plainly. The WHO has not earned the benefit of the doubt, and nations like the United States and the United Kingdom need to be running their own independent assessments, not outsourcing their public health response to Geneva.
But Marcus, isn't there a real danger here of fueling panic disproportionate to the actual epidemiological risk? The WHO is making a scientifically valid distinction. Hantavirus doesn't spread like a respiratory virus. Isn't the responsible thing to communicate that clearly rather than fan the flames? And Sophia, what's your take on this from an economic and institutional perspective?
Well, look, Marcus isn't wrong about the WHO's credibility problem, but I think he's conflating 2 separate issues. The science here is actually relatively clear. Hantavirus, in most of its known strains, does not spread efficiently between humans. That is a legitimate and important distinction to make. Where I think the real failure is, and this is what nobody in government wants to talk about, is the complete breakdown in the health surveillance systems that should have caught this before passengers were allowed to scatter. We have 7 confirmed or suspected cases, 3 deaths, and American passengers in Texas, Georgia, Virginia, Arizona, and California being monitored at home. That's not a WHO failure alone. That is a failure of the cruise industry's own health protocols, a failure of Argentine port health authorities, and frankly, a failure of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control to have robust systems for exactly this kind of scenario. The economic incentives here are obvious. Nobody in the cruise industry, nobody in Teneriffe's tourism sector, and nobody in Argentina's government wants this story to get bigger than it has to be. And those incentives corrupt the institutional response every single time.
I hear what Sophia is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely. Yes, the science says most hantavirus strains don't spread easily between humans. But the Andes strain, the strain associated with South America, the strain associated with Argentina specifically, is the exception. It has documented human-to-human transmission. So when we're reassured that it's not like COVID, we're being given a general rule that may not apply to the specific strain on this specific ship. That's not panic. That's asking the right questions. And here's what really gets me. A British crew member is in urgent need of medical care right now. A British passenger is in critical condition. 3 people are dead. At what point do we stop talking about not fueling panic and start demanding answers about why the response was this slow?
Here's what I want to know, because this is the question that will define what happens next. If secondary cases start appearing in the United States over the coming weeks, does the institutional architecture we currently have, the WHO, national health agencies, the CDC, actually have the capacity to contain this? Or are we about to find out that the lessons of COVID-19 were never really learned? Sophia, where do you see this going?
The way I see this playing out in the short term, if the strain involved genuinely has limited human-to-human transmission, this outbreak likely remains tragic but contained. The 7 monitored passengers in 5 American states are presumably not mixing with large populations in the way that, say, an asymptomatic COVID carrier might. Contact tracing is underway. The incubation period for hantavirus runs from 1 to 8 weeks. We're still inside that window for everyone who was on that ship. So the next 3 to 4 weeks are genuinely critical. If no secondary cases emerge, the institutional narrative of "we handled it" will solidify, regardless of how badly the initial response was managed. But if even one secondary case develops in Georgia or Texas, the political fallout for health authorities will be severe. And frankly, it should be.
Here's what concerns me most. It's not even the immediate outbreak. It's the precedent. What this case has demonstrated, again, is that our international health architecture has a fundamental gap at the border level. Passengers on an expedition cruise, traveling through the highest hantavirus incidence country in the world, were able to disembark, board international flights, and return to their home countries before any health screening was triggered. That is a border and biosecurity failure, not just a health agency failure. If this trajectory continues, where we treat outbreak monitoring as something that kicks in after people have already dispersed, we are not prepared for the next genuinely dangerous pathogen. And history tells us that pathogen is coming.
Sobering stuff from both of you. Marcus Webb, Sophia Reeves, thank you. 3 people dead, passengers in 5 states, a ship docking in a Spanish resort town, and the WHO's answer is it's not COVID. Let's hope they're right, because if they're wrong, we've seen this film before and we know how it ends. The Strait of Hormuz is on fire tonight. Not metaphorically, but dangerously, literally close to it. U.S. Navy destroyers fighting off Iranian fast attack boat swarms, American strikes hitting Iranian soil, Tehran claiming it fired back first, a fragile ceasefire in tatters, and now a bombshell U.S. intelligence assessment suggesting Iran can outlast this blockade for months and still has a substantial missile and drone arsenal ready to deploy. Europe's most powerful warship is heading toward the Persian Gulf. 20 million people in Africa are now at risk of food insecurity because of this war. And the question tonight is whether anyone in Washington actually has a theory of victory, or whether we are all watching an enormously dangerous improvisation play out in the world's most critical waterway. Joining me now are Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst, and Layla Nazari, our Middle East analyst. Marcus, let me start with you. The intelligence community has told the White House Iran can take the pain for months. Does that mean America's entire strategy just got exposed as wishful thinking?
Thanks, Emma. Look, I want to be precise about what that intelligence assessment actually means, because the framing matters enormously here. It doesn't mean America's strategy has failed. It means the strategy requires staying power that Washington needs to publicly commit to. 3 U.S. destroyers just repelled a coordinated swarm attack in the Strait of Hormuz and immediately struck back at Iranian launch sites. That's deterrence working in real time. The problem isn't the military capability. It's never been the military capability. The problem is the strategic ambiguity that surrounds it. Trump inherited a Middle East that Obama and Biden spent 12 years softening up for exactly this kind of Iranian aggression. The JCPOA gave Tehran sanctions relief while they built the very drone and missile arsenal we're now dealing with. Ben Shapiro has made this point relentlessly, and he's right. Deterrence requires that the other side believes you'll go all the way. The Iranians tested that belief on Thursday. We answered. But if the intelligence community is right that Iran can hold out for months, then the administration needs to level with the American public about what months of this actually looks like, economically, militarily, and strategically. What I will not accept is the suggestion that striking back was wrong. It wasn't. The question is what comes next, and right now I'm not convinced Washington has fully answered it.
But Marcus, here's the problem with that framing. You're describing a strategy that requires months of sustained commitment from an administration that's already under domestic pressure. With global oil markets going haywire and the IMF warning about 20 million Africans facing food insecurity because of this conflict, isn't there a point where military resolve becomes military stubbornness? And Layla, what's your take on this? Because you've been watching Iran's economic resilience very closely.
Well, look, here's what I think Marcus is missing, and it's a crucial data point. The intelligence assessment isn't just saying Iran can hold out. It's telling us that Iran's defense industrial base has been partially insulated from Western sanctions through Russian components and Chinese economic relationships. That's not a military problem. That's a geopolitical architecture problem, and you can't bomb your way out of it. The Strait of Hormuz handles 20% of global oil supply, 17 million barrels per day at peak flow. The economic damage of its effective closure isn't being absorbed by Tehran alone. It's radiating outward. Africa's regional growth is being cut by 0.3 percentage points. Energy prices are spiking globally. Free markets cannot function when the world's most critical energy choke point becomes a war zone. And here's the thing. France and the UK are moving toward a safe transit framework. And I actually think that diplomatic track deserves more serious attention than the hawkish commentariat is giving it. Not because I'm naive about Iranian intentions, I'm not, but because the economic clock is ticking for everyone, including Iran. They can outlast military pressure, but can they outlast an economy that's being strangled? That's the lever we haven't fully pulled.
I hear what Layla is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely. Economic pressure is not new to Iran. They've been living under sanctions for decades. The Revolutionary Guard doesn't respond to economic incentives the way a normal government does, because it isn't a normal government. Douglas Murray has written extensively about this. You cannot negotiate with a revolutionary theocracy using the same frameworks you'd apply to a rational state actor. And the French carrier group moving toward the Persian Gulf, fine, symbolically significant, but what are Paris's rules of engagement? If the answer is, we're here to facilitate dialogue, then Tehran will read that as weakness and probe accordingly. I'll say it plainly, Iran's swarm attacked 3 American destroyers. That's not a miscalculation. That's not an accident. That's a deliberate test. And the only language that changes the calculation is sustained, credible, overwhelming military superiority paired with a clear statement of what America's end state actually is. CENTCOM hit back fast and hard. Good. But we need the strategy to match the firepower.
Here's what I want to know, because both of you are dancing around the sharpest question of the night. If Iran genuinely can outlast this blockade for months, and if Washington doesn't have a clearly articulated theory of victory, are we looking at a situation where this ends not in a win for anyone, but in a grinding stalemate that nobody planned for? Layla, where do you see this actually playing out?
The way I see this playing out, and I want to be careful here because this is genuinely uncertain territory, the most likely near-term scenario is a negotiated off-ramp, probably within the next 60 to 90 days, that both sides can frame as a victory domestically. Iran will call it resistance. Washington will call it coercive diplomacy working. The UK-France safe transit proposal is probably the scaffolding that gets built around that arrangement. But, and this is the critical caveat, if the off-ramp isn't structured around verifiable, enforceable terms, we're not resolving this conflict. We're pausing it. And the intelligence community's assessment that Iran retains a substantial missile and drone arsenal means the pause will be armed and dangerous.
Here's what concerns me most, and it's the scenario nobody wants to say out loud. Iran's proxies in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen are still intact. We've been striking Iranian soil, but the network hasn't been decapitated. The real risk is a miscalculation, a strike that goes wider than intended, a retaliatory action that hits the wrong target, a fast attack boat that gets too close to the French carrier group. Any one of those could trigger a widening that no existing diplomatic architecture is equipped to contain. The trajectory suggests we are operating with dangerously thin margins in the Persian Gulf right now, and the ceasefire violations from both sides this week tell me those margins just got thinner. Watch Iran's proxy activity in the coming weeks. That's the early warning signal for whether this escalates beyond what we're currently managing.
Marcus Webb, Layla Nazari, a genuinely sobering conversation tonight, and I suspect we'll be back here very soon. When the world's most important waterway is a war zone, and the intelligence community is telling the White House the enemy can take the pain for months, that's not a briefing, that's a reckoning.
That wraps up today's top stories. I'm Emma. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.